She stood at the edge of the platform in her dead mother's dress, holding a carpet bag that contained everything she had left in the world. 3 changes of clothes, a Bible with her mother's handwriting in the margins, and $14 hidden in the lining of her corset. The train station in Abilene smelled like coal smoke and livestock and something else she couldn't name. Something like the end of a road. Around her, men in dusty hats moved with purpose. Nobody looked at her twice. Nobody needed to. She already knew what she was. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she was 24 years old, and she had just been sold. Not in those words, of course. The man at the land office in St. Louis had used words like arrangement and placement and suitable match. Her uncle had used words like opportunity and fresh start and once, when he thought she couldn't hear, burden lifted. But Ruth had grown up on a farm where they called things what they were. A drought was a drought. A dead calf was a dead calf. And what had happened to her, what was still happening to her right now, as she waited on this platform for a man she had never met, was closer to auction than arrangement. The telegram had said his name was Douglas Hart, rancher, 41 years old, widower. The land office intermediary had told her uncle that Hart was a serious man who kept to himself, that he had built his ranch from nothing over 15 years, that he had not been seen in town more than a handful of times in the last 8 years. The intermediary had said this like it was a recommendation. Ruth had read the telegram 3 times on the train, and each time felt the same cold settling in her chest. Not fear, exactly. Something more like resignation. She had already lost her father the previous winter, a stroke that took him between supper and breakfast with no warning at all. Her mother had been gone since Ruth was 12. Her uncle had made it clear within the month that the farm would go to her cousin, and that Ruth's continued presence was a charity he could not sustain indefinitely. She was not a child. She understood the arithmetic of her situation. She was looking down at her boots when she heard the footsteps stop beside her. She looked up. Douglas Hart was not what she had imagined. She had pictured someone weathered and diminished, the kind of man who needed a wife, the way he needed a new fence post, functional, replaceable, nothing personal about it. What she saw instead was a man who stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands so large they made the hat he was holding look almost small. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, and a jaw that had seen too much sun and not enough conversation. He looked at her the way you look at a mathematical problem you've been handed, not unkindly, but with assessment written plainly across his face. "Miss Calloway," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Hart," she said. He nodded once. He looked at her carpet bag. He looked back at her face. Whatever he was searching for, she didn't know if he found it. "Wagon's out front," he said. 2-hour ride. You eat anything today?" She hadn't. She'd been too nervous on the train to do more than drink water. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. "There's bread and jerky in the wagon," he said. "Long ride either way." He turned and walked toward the street without looking back to see if she followed. She followed. They didn't speak for the first 40 minutes. The land opened up around them as Abilene fell away, flat and enormous and the color of dried wheat under a sky that went on forever in every direction. Ruth had never seen country like this. In Missouri there were always trees, always some sense of enclosure, some green privacy to the world. Out here, everything was exposed. You could see weather coming from 50 miles away. She ate the bread and the jerky without comment. It was good bread, dense and slightly sweet, and it surprised her. She hadn't expected a man who lived alone to bake well. "Did you make this?" she asked. He glanced over at her. "Yes. It's good." He returned his eyes to the road. She thought that was the end of it. Then he said, "My wife used to make it with molasses. I couldn't get the proportion right for a long time." The past tense hung in the air between them. Ruth didn't press it. The ranch appeared on the horizon long before they reached it. A cluster of structures that grew slowly more distinct as the wagon rolled toward them. A main house built from timber and stone, substantial and square, with a covered porch running the length of the front. A barn, 2 smaller outbuildings. A garden plot on the south side of the house, gone to late-season brown but clearly tended through the summer. A windmill turning slowly in the afternoon light. It was not what she had expected. She had expected something meager, something that explained the difficulty of finding a woman willing to come here. What she had not expected was the boy. He was standing on the porch when the wagon came to a stop. 11 or 12 years old, she guessed, with his father's dark hair and his father's assessment in his eyes, and a weariness that made him seem older than he was. He did not wave. He did not smile. He watched Ruth climb down from the wagon with the careful attention of someone deciding something important. "That's my son," Douglas said from behind her. "Benjamin." Ruth looked at the boy. She knew what it was to lose a mother. She had been 12 when her own mother died, just about this boy's age, and she still remembered how the world had rearranged itself around that absence, how nothing fit quite the same way afterward. She looked at Benjamin Hart on his porch and saw a child who had been rearranged. "Hello, Benjamin," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Pa said you were coming. "I know," she said. "I hope that's all right." He looked at her with those two old eyes. "Ma's room is still Ma's room," he said. "Pa, put your things in the other one." "That's fine," Ruth said quietly. "That's exactly right." Something shifted in the boy's face, small, almost nothing. But she caught it. The first weeks were an education in the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who had made their peace with silence. Douglas rose before dawn without speaking, worked until the light failed without complaint, and ate whatever was put in front of him with the same steady gratitude regardless of what it was. He was not cold to her. He was not warm. He was present in the way a mountain is present. Solid, reliable, entirely without need of your opinion. Benjamin was harder. He watched her from doorways. He answered questions with the minimum number of words that technically counted as an answer. He ate her cooking without comment, which she eventually understood was his version of a compliment. Once, she found him sitting at the kitchen table after dark reading a book on animal husbandry that was clearly beyond his years, and she sat down across from him and didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything. And they sat like that for 20 minutes, and it was, she realized later, the most comfortable she had felt since arriving. She wrote to no one. There was no one left who needed to hear from her. What she did not expect, what she could not have anticipated from a telegram or an intermediary or any amount of preparing herself, was the land itself. She had grown up thinking of herself as an indoor creature, a woman made for kitchens and quiet rooms and the small domestic architecture of a settled life. But something happened to her out here in this enormous country. She started walking in the evenings after supper, just to the edge of the property and back, and then a little farther, and then farther still. The prairie grass in October turned colors she didn't have names for. Deep amber and rust, and a gold so saturated it looked almost liquid in the evening light. The sky did things at sunset that she had never seen. Sky do. Once she stood at the top of a low-rise and watched a storm build itself on the western horizon for almost an hour, a wall of darkness assembling slowly and with great intention, lightning playing silent and distant inside it. She didn't hear Douglas come up beside her until he spoke. "They'll miss us," he said. "Track north." She startled. He was standing perhaps 6 feet away, his hat in his hand, watching the same storm. "How can you tell?" she asked. "Wind direction. Smell of the air." He paused. "You learn to read it after a while." She looked back at the storm. "It's beautiful," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." They stood there until the light was gone and the storm had tracked north exactly as he said it would. And they walked back to the house without speaking, and Ruth found that the silence on the walk back felt different from all the other silences. Less like absence. More like something shared. It was Benjamin who first told her about what happened in town. She had asked in early November if she could take the wagon in herself to pick up supplies. She had begun to feel the walls of the ranch pressing in and wanted the movement, the errand, the brief sensation of being someone who went places. Douglas had agreed without comment. Benjamin had asked with steady casualness to come along. On the road, after perhaps 20 minutes of silence, the boy said, "People in town will talk to you about Pa." Ruth glanced at him. "What kind of things?" "About why he doesn't come in." Benjamin looked straight ahead. "About what they think happened with my mother." "And what do they think happened?" The boy's jaw tightened in a way that was purely his father. They think he was angry. With her. At the end. He said it like he had said it before, had constructed the sentence carefully over a long time. They're wrong. Ruth waited. She got sick, Benjamin said. Fever. It came fast and there wasn't a doctor close enough. Pa rode 2 days to find one, and by the time they got back, he stopped. He looked at the horizon. He wasn't angry. He just never found a reason to go back to town after that. Ruth held the reins and thought about a man riding 2 days through this enormous country, trying to outrun something that had already happened. Thank you for telling me, she said. Benjamin shrugged with the careful nonchalance of a child who has said something that cost him. I figured you should know, he said. Since you live there now. Since you live there now. She turned it over in her mind for the rest of the drive. The trouble arrived in December, with the first real snow. A man named Gerald Fitch came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning, a land agent from the county seat, with small eyes and a large manner and a document that he spread across the kitchen table with the proprietary ease of a man accustomed to being listened to. He represented a cattle consortium, he said. They had acquired rights to several properties in the area. He had been authorized to make Douglas Hart a fair and generous offer for the ranch. Douglas looked at the document for a long time without touching it. This land is deeded in my name, he said. Free and clear. Has been for 11 years. Of course, Fitch said pleasantly. This would be a purchase, voluntary, very favorable terms. Not interested. Fitch's pleasantness did not waver. The consortium is committed to this corridor, Mr. Hart. The acquisition will proceed one way or another. I'd encourage you to consider the favorable terms while they're still on the table. After Fitch left, Douglas stood at the kitchen window for a long time looking out at the snow. Ruth had been in the kitchen the entire time. She had heard every word. He'll come back, she said. Yes, Douglas said. Is there anything, legally, that they could use? He was quiet for a moment. Then he went to his desk in the corner of the main room and came back with a folded document. He placed it in front of her without comment. She opened it. It was the deed to the ranch, handwritten in faded ink, with the county recorder's stamp in the corner. She read it carefully. She had helped her father with his paperwork for years, had a practical head for documents, for the small print, for the places where language became a mechanism for removing things from people's hands. She read the deed twice. This is sound, she said, but look here, this parcel on the north boundary, the survey notation is ambiguous. If they have a cooperative county official, they could argue a border dispute on this section. Douglas looked at her. Really looked at her, for the first time in a way that was different from assessment. You read surveys, he said. My father had land troubles, she said. I learned to read everything. He sat down across from her. For the next 2 hours, they went through every document he had, every record, every receipt, every letter from the county dating back to the original claim. Ruth made notes in her careful handwriting. By the time they finished, they had identified 3 places where the consortium might try to manufacture a dispute, and a clear legal counter to each one. When they were done, Douglas looked at the pages she had filled and said nothing for a long moment. You're good at this, he said. Someone has to be, she said. He almost smiled. She saw it happen at the corner of his mouth and then consciously stop. Fitch came back in January, as she had known he would. This time he brought a county official named Hargrove and a surveyor she didn't recognize. They stood in the yard in the cold, and Hargrove produced a document suggesting that the north boundary of the ranch had been incorrectly recorded and that a correction, entirely routine, purely administrative, would need to be filed. Ruth came to the door. She had the deed, the original survey, and 3 supporting documents in her hands. She had written to the state land office 2 weeks earlier. She had the response in her coat pocket. She walked down the porch steps into the snow. The North Boundary Survey was confirmed by the State Land Office in 1887 and again in 1891, she said. She held up the state response. I wrote to them in January. They confirmed it again last week. The line is exactly where Mr. Hart's deed says it is. She looked at Hargrove steadily. If there's a discrepancy in your records, I'd suggest that's a problem for your office, not for this property. Hargrove looked at Fitch. Fitch looked at Ruth with his small eyes, reassessing. Mrs. Hart, he said. Miss Calloway, she said. Read the names on the document. Fitch took the papers she offered. He read them. He handed them to a surveyor, who read them too. The surveyor said something quiet to Fitch that Ruth couldn't hear. "We may need to revisit the consortium's position," Fitch said finally. "That would be wise," Ruth said. She stood in the snow and watched them leave. When the sound of their horses had faded entirely, she turned around. Douglas was standing on the porch. Benjamin was standing beside him. She walked back up the steps. "They won't stop," Douglas said. "No," she agreed, "but now they know it will cost them." Benjamin was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. It took her a moment to identify it. It was something close to pride. The winter was long and close and full of small discoveries. Ruth learned that Douglas got up an hour before dawn, not because he needed to, but because he liked the silence of the house at that hour. Liked having that time to himself before the world required things of him. She started getting up at that hour too, not to intrude on his silence, but because she found she liked it herself. They developed a habit of drinking coffee on opposite sides of the kitchen in the cold dark before dawn, not talking, just present. And this became the most honest part of her day. She learned that he had taught himself to read music from a book, that he owned a fiddle he never played anymore, that he had named every horse on the property and knew each one's individual disposition and history, the way some men knew their children. She learned that he left water out for a particular coyote that came to the edge of the property most evenings, that he had been doing this for 3 years, that he called the coyote nothing because, he said, naming things changed how you held them. She told him about her mother's handwriting in the margins of the Bible. She told him about her father's habit of talking to the crops. Full conversations, complaints, and encouragements, spoken aloud to the corn or the soybeans as though they were capable of being reasoned with. She told him that she had learned to love this country without planning to, that it had happened the way most real things happened, gradually and then suddenly, without permission. In February, Benjamin got sick. It was respiratory. The doctor from town said, nothing fatal, but the boy needed rest and warmth and careful watching. Ruth slept on a chair outside his room for 3 nights. She made the same broth her mother had made when she was sick, with the same herbs from memory. She read to him from the book on animal husbandry until he fell asleep, and then kept reading in a lower voice because she wasn't ready to stop, and she wasn't sure he was fully asleep anyway. On the 3rd night, Douglas came and stood in the doorway of Benjamin's room and looked at her sitting there and looked at his son sleeping, and his face did something complicated in private. He said nothing. He went back to his room. In the morning he made breakfast before she was up, eggs and salt pork and good strong coffee. And when she came to the kitchen, he had already set her cup at her place, and it was still hot. It was the most he had said to her without speaking. The spring came slowly, and then all at once, the way spring does in big country, weeks of tentative warmth, and then one morning everything green, the world completely committed to itself. Ruth walked the property line that morning, with her boots dark from the wet ground, and thought about the word home, about what it was made of, about how it was different from the place you grew up, how it was something you arrived at rather than something you started from. She was at the north fence when she heard the horse behind her. Douglas rode up and dismounted without hurry. He stood beside her looking north across the green country. "The consortium withdrew," he said. "Got word yesterday. They're moving their operation east." "Good," she said. He was quiet for a moment. He had something in his hands. She noticed it now, a small folded paper which he turned over twice and then held out to her. She took it. She unfolded it. It was a hand-drawn map of the property, every boundary carefully marked, every structure noted in his precise handwriting. In the lower corner, in ink that was slightly different, newer, he had written both their names. She looked at it for a long time. "I had it redrawn," he said, "by the county, formally." He paused. If you're willing." She understood what he was asking. Not what the words said on the surface, but the whole weight of what he was actually asking. Whether she would stay, whether this country had become hers too, whether she would let what had been building quietly all winter become something named. She thought about a man who rode 2 days through empty country and arrived too late. She thought about a boy who told her the truth on a road in November because he figured she should know, since she lived there now. She thought about coffee and the cold dart before dawn and a coyote that came every evening in the way a storm could build itself on the horizon with such slow and patient intention. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." He looked at her then with the same steadiness he turned on everything, the land, the weather, his son, the long work of building a life in hard country. It was not a romantic look in any of the ways she had read about romance. It was something older and more serious than that. It was the look of a man who had learned the difference between what lasted and what didn't. They were married on a Saturday in May at the county courthouse, with Benjamin as the only witness. He signed his name to the document with a seriousness that made the clerk smile. Afterward, the three of them ate at the hotel dining room in town, the first time Douglas had eaten in town in 8 years. And Benjamin ordered apple pie and ate every bite and told the waitress it wasn't as good as Ruth's, which was both a critique and, she understood perfectly, a declaration. The years that followed were not simple. The ranch demanded everything they had in good seasons, and more than that in bad ones. There were droughts and sick cattle, and a fire in the east barn that took 3 weeks to rebuild. Douglas's knee, injured years before she came, got worse in the cold and better in the warm, and she learned to read the weather partly from his face, the way he held himself in October when the temperature dropped. They argued about money and about Benjamin's schooling, and once, memorably, about a horse Douglas wanted to buy that Ruth considered an extravagance, an argument she eventually lost, and was eventually glad she lost because the horse turned out to be extraordinary. Benjamin grew into a young man with his father's steadiness and, she was surprised to discover, a great deal of her own stubbornness, a combination that made him, in her opinion, exactly suited to the country he'd been raised in. He took over the east section of the ranch at 20 and ran it with a quiet competence that made her chest ache with something she had no better word for than pride. They had 2 children of their own. A girl first, Clara, who arrived in the spring and screamed her opinions about the world from the first moment, and then 3 years later, a boy they named after Ruth's father, Thomas, who was quieter and more watchful and looked at everything with Douglas's old careful assessment. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, Ruth woke before dawn, as she had every morning for 2 decades, and went to the kitchen. Douglas was already there, as he always was, his coffee cup in his hands. The kitchen dark and warm and smelling of wood smoke. She sat across from him in the good pre-dawn silence they had been sharing for 20 years. "I was thinking," he said, which was how he started sentences when he had been thinking about something for a long time, "about the day I picked you up at the station." "You didn't look at me for the first 40 minutes, she said. "I looked," he said. "I just didn't let you see." She laughed. A real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest, and the sound of it in the quiet kitchen was the most natural thing in the world. He smiled then, fully, the way he had learned over 20 years to let himself smile, and the morning light coming through the window caught the silver in his hair, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that she had not known on that platform in Abilene, could not possibly have known, that the man watching her from across that enormous silence was a man worth a distance. She poured herself coffee and sat back down, and the day began the way all their days began, with the quiet and the warmth and the long, patient, ordinary work of a life that belonged entirely to them. I keep thinking about Ruth standing in the snow in front of those men from the consortium. No weapon, no husband beside her, just a stack of documents she had spent 2 weeks preparing, and the kind of calm that only comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and why. That image stays with me because it tells you everything about how her life turned out and why it turned out that way. Ruth didn't arrive at that ranch as someone powerful. She arrived with $14 and a carpet bag and no real choice in the matter. What she had, what she'd always had, was the habit of paying attention. Her father had taught her to read documents because someone in the family had to. She'd learned to read land surveys because the alternative was losing everything. She carried that knowledge into a situation where most people would have carried only fear, and it made all the difference. That's the thing about developing your mind quietly, over years, in circumstances that don't seem to call for it. You don't know when you'll need it until the moment arrives and you're the only one in the room who can handle it. I think about Douglas too, a man who had locked himself so completely inside his grief that an entire town had written a story about him. Angry, dangerous to be avoided. And the truth was so much simpler and so much sadder. He had ridden 2 days trying to save his wife, and arrived too late, and he never found a reason to go back to the world that had kept moving without him. What brought him back wasn't grand or dramatic. It was coffee before dawn. It was a woman sitting at his table reading his documents at 2 in the morning and finding the exact clause that would protect everything he had built. It was the slow accumulation of small moments where someone showed up consistently without needing anything from him in return. That's what good character actually looks like in practice. Not speeches, not gestures, but the quiet daily decision to be present and honest and useful. And Benjamin. That boy who told Ruth the truth about his father on a cold November road because he had decided she deserved to know, since she lived there now. 12 years old, carrying more than a child should carry. Choosing honesty over self-protection. That choice changed everything. It gave Ruth the context she needed to understand the man she had married. It gave Douglas a witness to his own story being told with accuracy and without shame. Children raised in hard places sometimes develop a kind of moral clarity that easier lives don't produce. Benjamin had it. What I take from all of this, and I've turned it over a long time, is that none of the good things in that story happened by accident or luck. They happened because 3 people, separately and together, kept showing up with their whole selves. Ruth brought her intelligence and her courage. Douglas brought his integrity, even when it cost him connection with the world. Benjamin brought his honesty, even when it would have been easier to say nothing. The land consortium came with money and leverage and legal maneuvers. They left with nothing because they ran into a family that had already done the work. The inner work, the unglamorous work, long before the confrontation arrived. I don't think you can plan for the hard moments. But I do think you can prepare for them the same way Ruth prepared, by building something real inside yourself during all the quiet years when no one is watching and nothing seems to be at stake. That's the only kind of ready that actually holds.